It is good that Chief of Navy is here and Admiral Kubu is here, because we're now going to move to the Navy and the Navy Museum. And it's important to take note that the castle is an integral part of naval culture, because the Royal Navy Reserves were in this establishment. When the Seaward Defence Force, the first naval force of South Africa, was created, the headquarters were in the castle. So it is us coming home to our first home when we come to the castle as naval officers. So I'm going to hand over to Commander Leon Steyn. Just a bit of background: he was an Air Force officer, and he saw the errors in his ways, and he came to our side. And he is also a former student of the Military Academy. He did his master's in the gender transformation of the Navy. So he's more than just a historian, he's also a gender historian. So he speaks for you ladies as well. So let me hand over to Leon before I say too much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad that I have the first opportunity this morning. There was the option to speak yesterday, late afternoon. I'm glad I've got a captive, fresh audience this morning to listen to me. The chaplain spoke about pioneers, and also in my recognition of people that are here today, I'd like to recognize as a pioneer of our Naval Museum, not just the Naval Museum, but even the work that was done here at the Castle Military Museum. Commander Mac Bissett, he's in the audience. He was here yesterday, today as well. Commander Bissett, don't you want to stand up, please? I would like to acknowledge you. Indeed, it takes people to make things happen, and that's pretty much the gist of my talk this morning. Not so much about the history of museums, it's a bit wider than just that. It is about the organization, it's about the people that made it happen and are supposed to make it happen, and it's a very important contribution that needs to be made. I want to start off, I'm adding this to my presentation, from the Defence Act 42 of 2002. It says here, the Defence Act 42 of 2002 is the first South African legislation to legally empower the Minister of Defence to establish military museums. Now take note of that date, 2002. In my talk, I have a timeline, and the timeline spans about 60 years. It starts off in the 1960s, it moves to the 1970s, the 1980s, and it will end at the present day. It will be an assessment of what has been done and where we're at the moment. My second last slide is an open slide where I'm going to ask you to participate, to give your inputs and your assessment, as asking the question, how do you see military museums specifically? When we look at the topic or my headline there, I would love to in a year or 2 years' time change that around to read the decline and the growth of Department of Defence military museums. I can easily say, listening to what Admiral Steyn said about the South African Museum and some aspects of the Naval Museum, we can probably say that yes, we saw that from decline it went to growth. But in the wider aspects of museum work within the Department of Defence, I will go with this. At the present moment, the growth and decline. Now, we're at a symposium that is termed Heritage. It's a Heritage Symposium. But now we're speaking specifically about museums. Let us find that link between heritage and museums. From the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, a very nice description there. Let's read that and see what they come up with. They say that the museum is the institution that preserve, interpret, and present heritage, acting as both custodians and storytellers of the past. It's very specific, the place of the museum. It connects the public to their story or their history through collections and exhibitions, while also serving as a space for education and community engagement. This can foster social inclusion and a sense of identity. So in that you see that the world of museums, it's very wide. Yesterday we spoke about just one aspect of museum work, which is heritage asset management. That's maybe a fifth of what we do at museums. There's so much more. So there's the scope or the overview of what I'll be talking about. As I said, it will be a historical overview spanning about 60 years. And may I just say, it will cover the 1960s, 70s, 1980s, the old SADF establishment of museums. I'm not here to say what they did in those years were better or the right way of doing it. Often the ideology behind that, we can question that today, okay? So, but I would like to use it as a lens through which we are looking to perhaps improve matters. August 2022, let's go back. I'm in my office. I received a phone call from a certain, I think he was still then just Dr., not Professor Effert Kleinans at the Department of Military History in Saldanha. He says there's a colonel in Pretoria at Foreign Relations, and he's trying to find a person that can speak to an incoming group of Uganda people, Defence Force, a delegation that came to South Africa. And they want a person to speak to them. A week later, I was on the plane heading for Pretoria. I did a presentation at the Defence College, and it was a great thing to realize and see this intent, a trend really, by African Defence Force countries to establish their own museum. 2 years later, in 2024, the Nigerian Army Heritage and Future Center also visited South Africa with that particular intent, a benchmarking visit to establish their own museum. It needs to be commended and supported, and I see it as a revitalization of our military heritage, African military heritage. You may not see it, but there in the corner, right-hand bottom corner, that's the artist's impression of the Uganda Military Museum. I must follow up and see where they're at this present moment. But on the other end, I asked the question at that same time, when they summoned me to Pretoria, a commander in Simonstown, why does the DOD not have at a level 2 or level 1, why is there no higher authority that speaks to heritage and museums specifically? Why is there not a director heritage? Why is there not at least a SSO museums that can manage this function from a higher authority? This was a real wake-up call to me, and one that I want us to look at. We'll come back to that a bit further. And in my discussion, you'll see what was done in the 60s and the 70s. When we speak about museums, we said we're going to be honest with each other, didn't we, yesterday? We said we're going to be there, we'll hit some nerves. So let's be honest. This is the ICOM, the International Council of Museum definition of a museum. I want to go as far as to say, if you're not adhering to this, you cannot call yourself a museum. You may be a collection of military artifacts or some wonderful things that you have collected, but you're not a museum. They say a museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that, first of all, researches, collects, conserves, interprets and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. It's open to the public, not closed on a Sunday. Accessible and inclusive. It fosters diversity and sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities, offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. Now, this definition is also subscribed by our own local SAMA, the South African Museum Association, our Naval Museum. We're a member of SAMA. That's a photo of me a few years back. I was on the committee of SAMA. and we subscribe to that. I know that Armor Museum is a member of SAMA. In fact, they hosted the national conference last year, and the Naval Museum is a member of SAMA. So that's the standard that is set. Dr. Hill said it's important to realize how central war has been to the creation and growth of museums. Museums have been central to the shaping of our understanding of war. You can ask new questions and tell new stories about those wars. Now, as I go along, you will recognize the fact that the museum, if you establish a museum, there needs to be some sort of cause, the causal effect of a war, a conflict, an event for the establishment of museums. And again, I want you to reflect on that. The question is, what do we currently need to establish a museum, or even I spoke to the Chief of the Navy this morning, memorial, an SS Mendy memorial. What is needed to get that done? Now we need to look at the early development and establishment of museums in South Africa to understand the current existence of military and war museums in South Africa. The oldest public museum in South Africa, the South African Museum in Cape Town, was established in 1825. The second South African museum to open was the Albany Museum in Grahamstown, with Port Elizabeth III in 1856, Bloemfontein following thereafter in 1877. The above mentioned museums were established as general museums to house educational collections of material and not just natural sciences, but also on history and ethnology. It is therefore clear that no dedicated military war museum or war museum was in existence at the turn of the century. Although evidence does exist that the aforementioned museums did collect and display artifacts related to earlier conflicts like uniforms and arms, associated, for instance, with the frontier wars in the Eastern Cape. It took the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, the First World War, 1418, Second World War, 1939-45, and South Africa's deep involvement in those wars and conflicts that prompted the establishment of two major military war museums. These two museums remain the most prominent in the country today, but they are not part of the Department of Defense. The first, the War Museum of the Boer Republics. The museum is situated just outside Bloemfontein, was officially opened by General Hertzog on the 30th of December 1931, and the War Museum of the Boer Republics focuses specifically on the historical aspects of the First World War, Jameson Raid, Anglo-Boer War, and the 1914 Rebellion. Second museum that I cite, the South African Naval Museum of Military History in Johannesburg. Following the First World War, there were no formal showcase or exhibition established in South Africa. But after the outbreak of the Second World War, Captain Agar Hamilton, he was an historian with the Union Defence Force, who suggested the establishment of a war museum. Field Marshal Jan Smuts, in his capacity as Minister of Defence and Commander of the Union Defence Force, approved this establishment. The scope of the museum was initially set to focus only on the Second World War, but later on they demarcated the area to include the era of 1910, 1912, the Union Defence Force establishment, and the Second World War as well. An important factor to consider, which would eventually impact on the establishment of separate military museums in the SADF, was a decision that was taken in 1945, and it was decided that the museum would be known as the South African National War Museum, and that it would be administered in terms of the State Aided Institution Act. This decision entitled the museum to receive grants in aid from the government, but also importantly, it meant that the administration and placement of this museum would be with the Department of, first of all, the Department of Interior, then it was transferred to the Department of Education, and eventually it was transferred to the Department of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology. This means, today it still means that the museum has been managed independently from the Defence Force, from whence defence it was actually we originated in the first instance. Several attempts were made by the old SADF to have the National War Museum return to the organisation of the department, but that recommendation was just a failing. That nothing changed in that sense. The early efforts to establish military museums by the Union Defence Force before 1966 can be traced back to the efforts of the Commandant General of the UDF, C.F. Beyers, who called for the preservation of 4 forts around Pretoria as early as 1913. And then in 1922, the British Ministry of Defence transferred the forts to the Union Defence Force to preserve them as historical monuments, and they were declared as such in 1938. The development, as we just said, of the War Museum in 1942 as a subsection of the Union Defence Force to collect Second World War artifacts was a major highlight. But in 1946, it was declared, as we said, a national state-aided institution and transferred. So it left the SADF without a museum of its own. Then in the 1950s, Minister of Defence F.C. Erasmus appointed a committee to investigate the development of military museums in Pretoria and Cape Town. At the same time, there was a commission, again recommending that the National War Museum need to be transferred back, but that was unsuccessful. And another attempt by Erasmus in the 50s to have Fort Skanskop developed as a military museum, but through the lack of funds, that was also unsuccessful. So here's what did it take to establish the first SADF museum. What was that first? It took the 5th birthday celebrations of the Republic of South Africa in 1966 and the appointment of an important person, Brigadier Louis Curier, also Dr. Louis Curier, as its director to have that, first of all, Fort Klapperkop, opened as a military museum on the 23rd of May 1966, and then secondly, the Castle Military Museum here in Cape Town, stone throw from here on the 25th of November 1966. So next year it will be 60 years. And then we also saw here in Cape Town, as an extension of the military museum, the opening of a maritime museum on the 18th of May 1971. Now, the Maritime Museum that you remember, there was a Maritime Museum at the V&A waterfront. Do you remember that? Do you remember SAS Somerset? This was the start of that museum. Today we don't find, there's no Maritime Museum. We call ourselves a maritime nation, but there's not a Maritime Museum open at the waterfront. And we know the fate of Somerset as well. Things developed to such an extent that a subsection called the Military Museum was established, and they resorted, Professor Klein spoke about the archives yesterday. The museum was another function of the archive organisation. They resorted under that. And then in 1972, there was an investigation to establish a full-on directorate military museums. They were called DMM. It was approved by the minister in 1973, and then with the appointment of Louis Curier as its first, by that time he was a colonel, appointed as the director of military museums. Now, DMM had a vision to establish military museums in each province. At the time, the military organisation had what was called the commands, regional commands. There was a Western Province Command, Eastern Province Command, and so forth. So that was the plan. So they started off Martello Tower in Simonstown, still in existence today, open to the public by appointment. Donkin Reserve Military Museum, Ikbega, Fort Skanskop, Tabatswane, or close to Tabatswane, Fort Skanskop, as I said, Fort Bloemfontein Military Museum, Fort Beaufort, also in the Eastern Cape, and Fort Wynyard Military Museum in 1987. So they did, it was quite ambitious, as you could see, but there were challenges, and we will talk about that challenges in that it has the same effect today. First of all, there were no career path for military museums professionals. The placement of the organisation Where do you place a director, military museums? Same with the archives. Where do you place that? It sort of falls between intelligence, it's got a communication function, it's got an education function as well. So with that, the DMM with the organization was downgraded again to a section. The director opted to retire, and with that, funding also waned on the regional command level. Also important factor was the end of the border war. It had some positive spin-offs, but in effect it meant that funding was slashed, and museums, heritage, not the most important thing for defence. That meant that a lot of those museums had to be closed. Also importantly, the inability of the museum itself to adapt. From what we saw in the late 1980s, the end of the Bush War, the so-called Bush War, the border war, to a new message of democracy. How do you change a museum exhibit within 4 years? That was a rapid transition that had to be made, and now we didn't have leadership to make those calls. There was an investigation, and it meant that a lot of those museums that are listed there were disbanded and transferred to other institutions. New dispensation, 1993, we see that the South African Air Force Museum, they were always very independent, already establishing their own museum in 1973. It led to the opening of a new Air Force Base Swartkop, purpose-built, not purpose-built, they actually utilized the 2022 hangars there, opened in 1993. They have satellite museums at Eysterplaat and Port Elizabeth. The South African Naval Museum, my museum, proudly so, opened in Simonstown in 1993. We spoke about the Submarine Museum yesterday. The Castle Military Museum, closed for a long time. The castle itself under restoration, and then it reopened in 1995. The Armour Museum in Tempe, opened by the Chief of the Army in 1996. And then, let's not forget, unit and regimental museums. Substantial collections, but can be termed then as museums. Okay, this is my open field of, maybe as time is running out, Captain, we can maybe leave this for the discussion when we have Q&A, because I want you to assess your museums. This is the four, let's call them the official museums of the DoD at this point in time. The Castle Military Museum, the Armour Museum, the Air Force Museum, the Naval Museum. Strengths, just as an example, Naval Museum, a big strength for us is that our positioning, we're on a tourist route, conveniently, the castle the same. Another strength for the Naval Museum, our volunteers, our Naval Heritage Trust. Air Force Museum the same, they have a very strong Friends of the Museum organization. Armour Museum, perhaps a weakness. I spoke to Major Swanepoel yesterday. Armour Museum, from 1996, there has been no structure for them yet. They don't have a permanent structure. They actually utilize staff from the School of Armour. Castle Military Museum. Previous curator retired in 1996. Am I right? Is that the date, Captain de Vries? 2015, sorry, 10 years back. Nathan Creef retired. Since that, then my good friend Captain de Vries was not appointed but acted for a while as the curator of the Castle Military Museum. Since then, there has not been a curator at the Castle Military Museum. Okay. We need to take charge of our own museums. That is my feeling. I'm going to leave this open. Maybe we need to close it, but please just put it in your minds. Maybe when we have time now with Q&A, we can speak about this. I would love your inputs on this. Conclusion, you can read all about that when the article is published. Thank you very much. I think I've done it on my time. Thank you, Captain. Thank you so much.
It is always difficult when you have to moderate a historian, because the passion passion of the subject, the very interesting little footnotes, the rabbit holes, all come out and it blossoms. So it's like reading a novel that doesn't want to end. So please forgive us for running a little bit over time, but I think it was worth the effort to allow Leon the space to talk about museums, his other passion.